Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Science on Tap. It's been a couple of months as we were taking a bit of a summer vacation. And by we, I really mean the Science on Tap team. So if you're wondering who I am, hello, I am Allie Coffin, and I'm the guest MC for the day so that Amanda could go off on a fabulous adventure. This isn't about us. This is all about you and about our speaker for the day. So we're really glad to have everybody here. Our speaker for the day is Joan Malouf, and she is an author, a professor emeritus from Salisbury University in Maryland, and the co-founder or founder and executive director of the Old Growth Forest Network. But before Joan comes to the virtual stage, just like to give you a heads up about a few things. The first is that we're really excited to have Joan because she is an author of several books, and her new book is called Treepedia, and that is just coming out now. How do you get Treepedia, you might want to know? Well, you can buy it in several different places, but we have a discount going specifically for you, our Science on Tap audience. So if you buy Treepedia from Broadway Books, you get a 15% discount through September 15th. And the code is here, ST for Science on Tap, Treepedia 15. And we'll get that in the Zoom chat or in the different places for you as well so that you get that code. So remember, please buy Treepedia, ST Treepedia 15, because after Joan's talk today, you're going to be even more excited about the book and learning all of these fascinating things about trees and why they matter so much. A bit about Science on Tap. This series has been going for several years now. Obviously, we used to be face-to-face and are looking forward to returning to face-to-face again with talks in the Portland, Vancouver metro area at several different locations. The Science on Tap part of the theme is still very much alive. So for those sitting in the comfort of your own living room, kitchen, backyard, whatever, please grab your cup and toast with your favorite beverage for Science on Tap. Science on Tap really started for this combination of science and fun and maybe the occasional beverage or snack, really geared for adult audiences. Not saying that kids of all ages are not welcome, they are, but there are so many programs for kids that really Amanda and her team saw that there was this need to make science accessible and meaningful and just fun for adults. And that's really the purpose of our Science on Tap and what we'll enjoy this evening. If you're interested in catching up on past Science on Tap events, they are on YouTube. So you can go to youtube.com, go to Science on Tap, ORWA, Oregon, Washington, find a bunch of past events, learn all the great things that you missed, and get excited for the next Science on Tap events as well. That's it for the announcements. On to the real show. I hope you enjoy learning all these fascinating things about trees. So without further ado, please help me welcome our speaker, Joan Malouf.
Thank you so much, everyone. I love the idea of the program of Science on Tap, and I really wish I were with you in person. When I see that the photos of the audience there, it makes me really miss a live audience, but I'm happy I can reach people other ways. So I live in Maryland. Tonight I'm in a hotel in Virginia because I'm on my way to South Carolina to dedicate a forest into the Old Growth Forest Network, and you're going to learn all about that tonight. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And if I were with the program in the audience tonight and had a beverage, this would be my beverage of choice, homegrown, and it is by Burley Oak Brewery, which is 1 mile from my home in Maryland, and it's made with all local ingredients, and it's delicious. It's my favorite. So cheers, everyone. Have a sip if you have a brew. Since this is a Science on Tap program, I'm going to start by sharing my science credentials. I am a scientist proudly, although I have gotten away from my experimental science and gotten more into books, which I'll be talking about tonight, of course, and also running a nonprofit. So these images are on the left. I was working on my master's degree, measuring the photosynthesis rates of plants. On my right, I'm studying pollination of a rare wildflower in the Colorado mountains. And for some reason, all my life, it has been about plants. I remember being interested in plants from the time I was 4 years old, and that has never left me. And my scientific research led to scientific publications, those journals that are filling up all the libraries that we can now thankfully access electronically. But at a certain point in my life, in my late 30s, right around the time I turned 40, I started becoming very interested in the largest of the plants, the trees. And that's also when my ecological education had blossomed beyond plants to plant-animal interactions and all the other living beings in an ecosystem besides the plants. And I realized that the forests with the trees were creating this habitat for these creatures and how important that was and how they are. But then I would see this, native forests being cut down, these forests that were, in this case, these trees are probably 100, 125 years old and nothing left behind. These are clear cuts. One is in Maryland and one is in New Jersey. And I'm sure you've seen these and they are heartbreaking. And especially as an ecologist, they say to be an ecologist is to live in a world of wounds, and you can really feel this. And I would ask people about this clearing of the forest. They'd say, oh, you know, the trees will grow back. I'd say, well, what about the box turtles? Where are they going to go? They're not going to make it through a destructive clear cut like that. What about the migratory birds that come back every year, often to the same tree for 10 or 15 years, make a nest, and they come back and that nesting site's not there anymore? And we know the result of these cuts is that we are losing biodiversity on the planet. I mean, there's many reasons for that, but how we treat our forests is just one of the reasons. And to me, that is the largest crisis, the largest ecological crisis. And it is hardly discussed. At this point, I realized that I was going to have to speak out more widely about my feelings about the planet and the forests, and share the fact that without beech trees, such as this one in Pennsylvania, we're not going to have the little plant beech drops, which can only live where there are beech trees, because this plant is parasitic on the roots of beech trees. It doesn't really hurt the beech, but this is how this plant gets its nutrients, this tiny little plant. So if you cut the beech tree, you're destroying beech drops. Similar stories for so many different trees. This is a holly tree, and living on the holly leaves are these insects called holly leaf miners. This is the little larvae that makes this trail over the leaves. And that egg for the larvae is laid by this holly leaf miner fly. And that larvae can also be home to a parasitic larvae. So without the holly tree, we have no holly leaf miner, and we have no parasitic wasp of the holly leaf miner. So all of these things are connected. And without sycamore trees, we have no sycamore lace bugs. This is a tiny little insect that's been magnified here, but it's so beautiful. So when we clear these forests and cut these trees, we're not just destroying the trees, we're destroying all these things that are living on the trees. And I thought I would take a little break from my science and tell some of these natural history stories in essays. And what happened was the essays turned into a collection, and that collection of essays, at one point I realized, oh, I'm writing a book. And that was my first book, Teaching the Trees, that came out in 2005, telling these stories. One of the stories in this book was about visiting an old growth forest in the East, in Maryland, one closest to my home. And while I was walking through that forest, I really got a sense of the forest air in a way that I'd never appreciated before. And I realized that, I did the research and realized that this forest air is very healthy for us. I mean, that wasn't even being discussed in 2005, but I wrote a chapter about it. So when the book came out, everyone had the same question: where's that forest? I want to visit that forest, because they all had this desire to be in an old growth forest in the East, which is so rare, and to experience the air in the old growth forest. And I realized that I had to write another book that let people know where the old growth forests are in the East, because we all know the Eastern, so we can get on a plane and we can fly to California and we can go to Muir Woods, or we can go to the Hoh Rainforest and we can see some wonderful old growth, but is there anything left in the East? And the answer is yes, but very little. There's only 1% left in the East and 5% left in the West. So this book, Among the Ancients, talked about travels to one old growth forest in each of the 26 Eastern states, and very different Eastern old growth versus Western old growth. So of course, that Western old growth is a old growth redwood I'm hugging in California, and the Eastern old growth is in Kentucky, and that tree is 326 years old, so quite old for an Eastern tree. And a lot of people would see a tree like that and they wouldn't recognize it as original growth, old growth. So part of my challenge is to educate people about that. We do have some beauties in the East, but this is about as big as they get. This is a tulip poplar tree in Alabama. And just like with the Western forests, one of the most important ecological components of the forest is the downwood, the coarse woody debris. More other organisms live on the downwood than live on the living trees. So this is an American chestnut tree in the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee, still feeding the moss, still feeding the insects, still feeding the amphibians and the reptiles, even though this species is pretty much extinct from the Eastern forest because of the American chestnut blight. And the importance of snags, you know, the dead standing trees too. Bears in the East used to den in these standing hollow trees, but now that most of the large trees have been removed, they have no places to den there anymore. Now it's mostly in rock caves. So the history of old growth forest in the US is told in these graphs made in 1925. So the area in black is the area that used to be called virgin forest. Now we call it old growth forest in what was going to become the United States of America, and it wasn't yet. And of course, there were native peoples living all over this land then, and they were clearing trees for crops and clearing trees for their villages, but they weren't using trees as a commodity. They weren't selling them and shipping them around the world, which is what happened with the European settlers as they came in. So by 1850, after the European settlers were here, cutting away, shipping away, using the trees for everything you can imagine. You can see here the eastern old growth forests, especially near the coasts, have been cut pretty hard, but not in the West yet, because the Western expansion hadn't really moved a lot of the European population out there. But by 1920, this is what the status of the old growth looked like. So by that point, the Western forests were being cut very hard too. And I think it was about at this point that finally the conservation movement they saw what had happened to the East and were able to slow down a little bit of the cutting out West anyway. And that's why in the West, there's 5% of the old growth left, and in the East, only 1% left. And this is the estimate of the area of old growth forest today. Now, there's actually more places, I'm thinking of the East here now, that have old growth, but if a dot represents 25,000 acres, a lot of these old growth areas are much smaller than that, maybe 500 acres. They wouldn't show up on this map. So the sad story here is that we've cut out almost all of our original forest. And now we're recutting our second growth forest too. And I feel like we're not leaving enough to recover. I have no problem with using wood. You know, I'm sitting at a wood desk right now, writing on paper that I try to buy recycled, but we use wood products all the time. But I feel like there needs to be more of a balance. So I want to be a voice for that balance. Can we make sure that no more old growth forest gets cut from this little bit that's left? And can we let some more of the second growth forest recover to be old growth again? And this is a generational project, right? Because the trees live so much longer than us. So if we want to pass on to the next generation older intact forests and slow this loss of biodiversity, how are we going to do that? What can we do? So this is the point in my career and in my writing, I started thinking about what can I actually do to make a difference. And in my many travels, I thought, well, you know, it's not enough that there's a Hoh rainforest in Muir Woods and there's Cook Forest in Pennsylvania. We need to have old forests near each community, at least an example of it, so people can know what the ground produces, what their native land can make. If it's just all cut over forest, no one will ever understand the biodiversity and the beauty of old forests. So somehow out of the blue came to me this idea that we needed to preserve one forest in each county, protect it from logging, open to the public, relatively accessible, so no child will be very far from one of these forests. Of course, that was the counties that can support forest growth that are shown on this map in various colors. These are just different forest types. So I had the idea, and then I went and Googled counties of the US, and this is the map that came up, and I was, wow, that's a lot of work. Over 3,000 counties, and about 2,370 of them can support forest growth. But that's what I've been doing for the last 10 years, really, is working on this project that I call the Old Growth Forest Network. And we currently have 139 forests in 25 states. And on Saturday, we'll be adding one in South Carolina, so that'll be a new state. And if you're interested in where these forests are, you can go to the website oldgrowthforest.net and look at the forests. And we're supported entirely by donations from small family foundations and individuals that believe in the mission. And so there's the donate button there. And we also are increasing our staff. We have volunteers all across the country that we call county coordinators that are looking for the forest in their county that would be the best forest to add to the Old Growth Forest Network. So just an example how we do our work. I know a lot of you may be listening from Oregon because that's where Science on Tap started. And yes, we do have some Oregon forests that are in the Old Growth Forest Network. And those are shown in dark green here. They were dedicated in 2019. And we have some others that we're working on, shown in light green. The red stripes are where we have our county coordinators, our volunteers. So you can see that we need more volunteer county coordinators in Oregon. It's a fun job. We just give you a list of forests that are nominated, places to check out, and you get to talk to all the tree people in your county. So the yellow shows counties where there have been nominations. Anyone can nominate a forest, and then the volunteers go and check those forests for the best. But there's many forests in Oregon, many counties in Oregon that don't even have nominations yet. So we're just building momentum. We'd love to have you be part of that. So these briefly are the counties that already have forests in the network, where they are. And the bottom is the counties that have nominations. And these are the counties that need county coordinators. We are having our first Washington State dedications coming up in 2 weeks. And if you're on the mailing list, then you get invited. And you know, pre-COVID, that's going to become a word of its own, right? They were very big dedications, and we do hikes together. Now they're a little bit smaller, but it's a nice place to be outside, right? It feels safe. And we welcome you to check out these events on our website and participate. Now back to the books, right? So I'm still writing. But it's more than just creating this network. If that weren't enough, now we also speak out for saving the threatened forests, because all across the country, there are special forests, older forests that are at threat of being removed, whether it's the next transportation project or the next big box stores going in. And we try to help people save these special forests in their community from being cut. And one of the excuses that I kept hearing was that forests must be managed to be healthy. And I decided, since I'm a scientist, I would question that. Really? Forests must be managed to be healthy? And forests have been around for millions of years, and they've been doing just fine. All of a sudden, we think we need to get in there and do something to them. So instead of just having an opinion about this, or yes or no, as a scientist, what we do is look at the data. So I embarked on a project where I did research, checked out the scientific research. Anytime a scientist had compared an old uncut forest with a managed forest, and that scientists could have been studying snails or salamanders or wildflowers or bats or bears. No matter what it was that scientists studied, if they compared those two, I collected the data and wrote about it in this book, Nature's Temples. And this is what I learned in a nutshell. The older unmanaged forests, so these are the old growth forests, have a higher level of carbon storage. They're holding carbon, taking it out of the atmosphere faster and holding it. More salamanders, not only in numbers, but in species. Same with lichens. The older the forest is, the more lichen species you're going to have. The older a forest is, the more beetle species, the more fungi you'll have. So if you love fungi, go to the old forests. That's where you're going to find the most variety, and snails and wildflowers. This book is going to be updated and expanded, and it will be published by Princeton University Press in 2023. And I'm including new chapters to going to look at underground ecology, and I'm going to look at fire ecology as well. So I'm sharing my other books before I get to Treepedia. We're going to talk about that. The next thing that happened was this fabulous photographer, Robert Llewellyn, said, can you write some words to my photos? And beautiful photos to just celebrate the beauty of the forest. And this is a giant sized coffee table book with amazing images in it. And now we get to the star of the show, which is Treepedia. And Treepedia is part of a collection of books called the Pedia series, put out by Princeton University Press. So first they published this little book, Fungipedia, and it was very popular. And they decided, we're going to do all of these little pedias, and came to me and said, would you do the Treepedia? I was very honored and excited to do that, because I remember the days of encyclopedias. Not everybody does. You know, I'm old enough that I remember I was envious that my girlfriend's family had encyclopedias and I didn't, because my parents didn't want to spend the money for the encyclopedias. And I was such a geeky, nerdy girl that I would have been reading those encyclopedias cover to cover. And then the encyclopedias, of course, fell out of popularity as the World Wide Web came online and we could find anything at our fingertips in a moment. But these little pedia books, they're kind of a encyclopedia 2.0. They're coming back to a book that you can hold in your hands, but they're tiny and the information is more fun and it's more condensed. So just love being part of this series. And I jokingly say, there's my coffee table book in brown, The Living Forest, that giant thing. And the little pedia is sitting on top of it in the smallest room in the house, which is, I think, the perfect place for them to pick them up at a moment's notice. Altogether, the four of those weigh less than the giant living forest, and they have these nice cloth covers. They're just a delight to hold, which is one of the reasons we love books still. I do. And the other thing I like about this series is that they're illustrated. And I was able to invite a wonderful young woman named Maren Westfall to work on this project with me. And it's her first book project. And she was delighted to have this opportunity. And we worked so well together. So really, I was just given a Fungipedia and the concept. And I sat down and made a list of special trees that I wanted to talk about. I couldn't talk about every tree in this book, right? It's too small, it's too delicate. So just some of the tree species, but I also wanted to talk about some of the special tree people. I wanted to talk about some of the special forests in the world. I wanted to talk about some of the special concepts, like proforestation is a new concept. So I just sat down one day and I just rattled off this list. And it was very interesting because I thought that the list might change over time and I'd add things and take away, but really it stayed the same. That was the list that I worked off, and my original instinct was good there. So these illustrations, of course, a pine cone on the top left. And the other illustration is of a Bullhorn Acacia. And this is a plant that has a symbiotic relationship with an ant. And the plant produces, well, has food and housing for this ant. The food is in the form of these tiny protein nodules that are at the tip of the leaflets. The people studied these little protein nodules. They couldn't figure out what they were there for, but then noticed that the ants were eating these protein nodules. So these are ant food that the tree is growing. The tree is also producing nectar from the base of the leaflet, the leaf, right here where it meets the stem, little drops of nectar, and the ants drink that nectar. So we know that flowers make nectar because they want to reward the pollinators that come to visit them and get them to visit more. But why would a plant produce nectar at the base of this leaf? Well, it's again to feed these ants. And the thorns have a hollow space in them. So the ant queen bites a hole in the thorn, lays her eggs in there, raises her first crop of babies, we want to call them that. They go out, they feed on these protein nodules and the nectar. But once that colony gets to 150 ants, this is when the ants start then being of service to the plant, because at that point, they have a critical number and they can start roaming over the whole acacia plant. And what they're doing is attacking anything else that's on the plant. So if there's caterpillars that are trying to eat the leaves, the ants will attack and kill the caterpillars. The ants will even attack animals such as goats that are trying to feed on the leaves. So these ants can sting, and they sting the goats and the goats leave. The ants can actually garden around the base of the plant and remove other plants that are going to grow up to be competitor. So, these short little stories. It was fun for me also to do this book because I could focus on trees that do not grow in North America, because as I described, all my other books are about the trees in the US, and a lot of that in the Eastern US. So now I get to write about the Baobab tree. And I'm sure you've all heard of Baobab trees and seen pictures of these amazing trees that can store water in their stems and can live for over 1,000 years. But did you realize there's actually 9 species of Baobab tree? We tend to lump all these together, but there are actually 6 species that live in Madagascar, 2 in Africa, and 1 in Australia. And they produce these beautiful, giant, large flowers, and actually a fruit that's the size of a small coconut that's edible. So the stories about the baobab, and then cacao. Cacao is an amazing plant because it's been cultivated by humans for 4,000 years. And these pods that you see in that drawing, the pods grow right out of the trunk of the tree and the main stems. So we're used to seeing the fruits and the flowers on the tips, but no, these grow out of the stem. And the pod are beautiful colors. They can be purple, they can be orange, they can be yellow, they can be green. They're all different colors on the same tree. And they're harvested when they're ripe, when they have the color. And then the pods are split open, and inside this pod is this sweet, sticky substance and these dark bean-like cacao seeds. But in order to make chocolate from these things, the sticky white substance has to stay with the seeds and ferment. And part of that fermentation that involves other microorganisms is what imparts the flavor to the cacao. So just like perhaps the brew that you're drinking, the different types of yeast add different flavor. It's the same way with the cacao bean. And then once that fermentation has been stopped and the seed has dried out, then the seeds need to be cracked open, and it's the part inside the seed that is finally used to make the cocoa butter or to make the cocoa, to make the chocolate that we love. The other image here is the Bodhi tree. And the Bodhi tree is the one that Buddha became enlightened under. And this was 2,600 years ago. It's actually a type of a fig tree, and a fig tree of the same species still grows in that very spot today, and that's in Bodh Gaya in India. And when Buddha sat under that Bodhi tree, he was not the Buddha yet, right? He was a young prince, and he sat in meditation under the tree for 3 days and 3 nights. And that is when he became enlightened. And many people are familiar with that story, but they haven't heard that of what he did next, because for the next week, he stood and looked at the tree day and night. So first he sat under the tree, became enlightened after a number of days. And then the next thing he did was stand and stare at the tree for many days. And it wasn't until the 5th week after that happened that he began answering questions about what his experience was like. And what he shared became the basis of the religion, Buddhism. Just a couple more. I'm not going to go on and on. Just want to tease you a little bit. There are 100 different entries in here, but I wanted to add something from the Pacific Northwest. And if I could see you raise your hands, I'm sure many of you recognize the cone on the left, which is from a Douglas fir tree. And it's actually not a fir, not related to the fir, it's in the pine family. And Douglas fir trees are easy to recognize by the shapes on their cones that the Native American tale says are the shapes of the back end of a mouse. You can imagine this long pointy part being the mouse's tail and the short parts being the mouse's hind legs. And the Native American story is that there was a wildfire raging through the forest, and the mice were in danger, and they ran to all the different trees to try to get help. And they ran to the big leaf maple, but the big leaf maple couldn't help because it had smooth bark and there was nowhere to hide, and the mice couldn't climb up. And they ran to the hemlocks, but the hemlocks just had these little tiny cones. And they ran to all the other trees, and none of the trees could help. But finally, the Douglas fir tree said, "You can climb up into my cones." And the space wasn't quite large enough for the mice, so their hind feet and their tails were out and they got singed, but they survived. And to this day, the mice are grateful to the Doug fir tree. So that's how you always know you're looking at a Doug fir tree, because of those little mice. And then the Pacific Northwest species we can never forget about, the northern spotted owl. Didn't Maren do a beautiful job with these illustrations? I actually purchased this one from her for a friend of mine. He has it hanging on his wall. So the northern spotted owl depends on old growth forests for many reasons, mostly because of its hunting. It eats small mammals, and it needs to have space to fly under the canopy of the trees to hunt for these small mammals on the ground. And where you have young forests of plantation, the trees are too close together and the limbs are too close to the ground, and the owl can't fly through there. And so those young plantation forests are of no use to the northern spotted owl. Also, the owl nests either in the top of trees that have broken out, these old trees, or in cavities in the tree itself, holes in the trees. And so the owls depend on these old trees for nest sites and for protection from the elements. And also the food that they feed on, like the voles, live in the old growth forests. Some of these voles live in the Douglas fir tree, up in the branches for their whole life and never come down to the ground. So the owls can also eat them right off of the trees. So you cut down the old trees, you're reducing the mammal population, you're reducing the spaces for the owl to hide. And also these owls are very shy. They need large areas of habitat measured in hundreds of acres with no other owls in them and no humans. They just form these pair bonds and need this quiet space. So we have worked very hard to try to protect the Pacific Northwest old growth forest now for these northern spotted owls with the Northwest Forest Management Plan. But the irony is that the owls are still endangered, because what has happened now is that barred owls, which were an owl of the plains, for some reason we don't completely understand, they've expanded their range into these Pacific Northwest forests. And where the two types of owls come together, the northern spotted owl loses out, primarily because it is smaller and it is shyer. And where there's a conflict between owls, the northern spotted owl will just leave the territory to the barred owl, and then has nowhere else to go. And the barred owls are doing very well. And as a result of that, what should we do? Because the barred owls are not endangered, but the northern spot owls are endangered. And I don't have an answer to that, but some scientists have said we need to eliminate the barred owls from these areas. And they have been shooting and killing barred owls in an effort to protect the northern spotted owl habitat. And you may have heard of that because you're living in that part of the land, and it's very controversial. And these are some of the stories in the book. And lastly, I wanted to share the story about one of the people I talked about in the book. I also talk about Wangari Maathai and John Muir and the Lorax, if you want to consider Lorax a person, but also some contemporary people that are living now that you might not have heard of. This woman, Nancy Stranahan, she is a hero to me. She lives in Ohio and she loves nature. And in 1995, she saw that this tourist attraction in Ohio called Seven Caves was going up for sale. And Seven Caves it was along a stream, and there's beautiful rock cliffs, and there's wonderful diversity of trees and wildflowers, and there's also caves that bats live in. Just a fabulous natural area, that biodiversity, right? And it was going up for sale. And it could have just become private homes. You know, a developer could have bought it and put houses, and sold it, beautiful rock cliff view. And Nancy decided that couldn't happen. The selling price was $203,000. So she formed a nonprofit organization to try to raise the money. She raised the money by using profits from the coffee shop and the bakery that she owned. So all the profits from that went in to try to buy Seven Caves, but still she couldn't come up with enough money. Finally, at the very last minute, the state and the Nature Conservancy stepped in to help. That was in 1995. And then a piece of land right next to that spot came up for sale. And she said, well, we have to buy this too. And then she got on a roll. And now in 2021, she has raised over $17 million. She has been involved in 116 land transactions. She has preserved over 7,000 acres, and she's not slowing down because people like me see what she's done and they say, I want to jump on that bandwagon. I want to help her out. So one person really can make a difference for these forests. And this is a group of people that Nancy got together to celebrate one of our forest dedications into the old growth forest network. And this was Fort Hill in Ohio, a beautiful old growth forest. And this photo reminds me of how we all have to stand together to protect the forests. We just all have to do our part, whether you're going to donate, be a county coordinator, be a scientist to write about these things, be an illustrator, photographer. The forests need us. And I am so appreciative of your attention tonight, and I hope you'll connect with me. I like to say we're not just a network of forests, we're a network of people who care about forests. So read about them, enjoy them, preserve them. And I'm happy to take questions too. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Joan. So everybody, I know we can't actually give Joan a round of applause, but thank you. It was a real pleasure to hear about some of your path and some of your stories, and some of the stories of others as well, like that last story. So we've had a number of questions coming in. I'm going to start with a few questions that are about the Old Growth Forest Network. So one question that came in was asking about the benefits to an old growth forest to being nominated or dedicated as an old growth forest network. So what's in it for the forest?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a number of different benefits. One, I'm thinking of a forest in West Virginia that it was an old growth forest, but it didn't have very good access. It was in a park, and they were able to get extra grant funds to make a special trail that would lead near the forest, but wouldn't disturb the forest itself. Other times, I look at it as an extra layer of protection for the forest, because we're saying this forest is special. It's the most special forest in this county. And then if anything were ever to happen, somebody would decide that forest should be cut, then I think everyone who's supporters of the Old Growth Forest Network, there's over 4,000 of us now, would all work together to make sure that forest got protected. So there are some benefits to the forest, but then there's also benefits to the people by knowing where these special forests are, and to be able to get a sense of what the old growth forests look like, and to be able to share that with the younger generation.
Great, thank you. So along those lines then, now that we know what's in it for the forest and the people that are near that forest, you mentioned a process about how anybody can nominate a forest to be an old growth forest, and then that you have volunteers that assess which forest should receive that designation in a given county. So can you talk a little about that process? If I'm a forest and I want to be the old growth forest, what do I need to be?
Yeah, thanks. So to nominate a forest, first of all, if you have a pet forest, you think, oh, this forest should really be in the Old Growth Forest Network. You could just go to our website, oldgrowthforest.net, and there's a place for nomination, and you don't have to prove anything on there. You can nominate anything, but what we're looking for in these forests is, first of all, as old as possible. Old growth is best. Not every single forest in the Old Growth Forest Network is old growth yet. Some of them are future old growth forests, but we make that very clear in the description of the forest. Some are old growth, some are future old growth. Old growth is better if it's available. Then we're also looking for protected from logging, and that's the most difficult. And that's also where we can do some of our most important work, because sometimes people will nominate a forest to us, like the Federation Forest in Washington outside of Seattle. There's a beautiful old growth forest, and everybody assumes that it's protected from logging. We go to the management and say, okay, your forest looks like a wonderful forest. We'd like to add it to the Old Growth Forest Network. Show us how it's protected from logging and from commercial logging. And they say, well, it's actually not. And sometimes they're surprised by that and then want to take the steps to get it preserved. And other times they don't, the management, but we can at least share that with people and say, did you know that that's forest is not protected? Then the other piece you have to have is relatively accessible. So we're looking for places where grandparents can bring grandchildren that people can get to, not something that you have to hike half a day through the wilderness to get to. So we like places with a parking area and a little trail. We're looking for these little gems people can get right into.
Great, thanks. And so I'm thinking about a close friend and obsessed fisherman who used to run and bike just to train for fishing. So the old growth forest that he was fishing in would not be good candidates because he and Sasquatch were the only ones there.
Yes, that's
okay.
right.
Great.
There's some beautiful old growth forests out there, but that's, not what we're looking for the network that's going to connect, because we're connecting people with the forest too. Yeah.
Right. So then following on with the old growth forest, and you were talking about the designation of an old growth forest being better than a future old growth forest, but that for the network, you're interested in both.
Yeah.
And so we had a question come in about really the benefits of the old growth forest. You talked about old growth forests having higher carbon sequestration. Can you talk a little bit more about why that is?
Yes. So what we found was the higher biodiversity, of course, and the reason for that is because of the structure, because you have in the old growth forest, it's not all big old trees. You have big old trees, but you have medium-sized trees, and you have tiny little seedling trees, and you have the downed trees, and the big dead trees are very important for that ecosystem too. So all of these things are habitat for different types of organisms. Some things live on the dead trees, some things live on the living trees. And even just the surface area on all of that old growth trunk and branches and leaves, that's all surface area for different insects. So you're going to have more types of insects, and then you have more insects, you have more types of birds. So you're going to have more food for the birds, whether it's insects or berries, and you're going to have more nesting spaces because you're going to have more cavities. And it's just so complex. And also it can take a long time for some of these organisms to spread into a forest. So once a forest has been cut, a lot of the wildflowers are destroyed, and it can take decades for those wildflowers to spread back into those places. And the longer a time period that goes by, the more different organisms can move into that forest. So whether you're talking wildflowers or lichens. So the complex, I'm narrowing it down, the complex structure and this time component are two things that make the old growth forest very special.
Now, okay, now I understand a bit more about the old growth forest, and that answers that question really beautifully. Thank you. So moving to a very practical and somewhat depressing question, but one that's on so many minds in this country, and particularly here on the West Coast. Thinking about all of that complexity that you just talked about and all of the different layers to an old growth forest, how have the forest fires here on the West Coast affected your work and perhaps old growth forests more generally?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of our forests was Big Basin, which burned, and it's in recovery now. And there was another forest, Nelder Grove in California, that I was going to put in the network. It's a sequoia forest, and then it burned, and I decided I wasn't going to dedicate it yet. I'd wait and see what the recovery was like. So personally, I've been educating myself about the effects of fire on the forest. I didn't know that much about it at first, but I've been learning much more. And I would recommend to anyone Chad Hansen's new book, Smokescreen. It's been very helpful to me. And what I understand now from his work and others is that really the most devastating spread of fires is through the forests that have already been cut. So it's once you cut a forest, it's going to get drier, it's going to get hotter, there's going to be more fine material that will burn more, and those are the most dangerous forests that can really take off. Now, I'm not saying old growth forests can't burn, it can, but it will usually go slower, be somewhat cooler. And also the difference is that some of those trees are so large, the stems, that a lot of that carbon is going to stay in that forest. You know, as a Eastern person, I'd hear on the news about these wildflower fires, and I'd think, oh, they burn to the ground. But it's not like that. You go to these forests and you'll still see a lot of those trees standing, and they're maintaining the carbon in there and that structure. And so a lot of those organisms will live through one of those fires. So the thinning is actually not good. That for a while we were thinning because we thought, well, that it'll make it more difficult for the fire to spread. But what we're learning is that the thinning makes it easier for the fire to spread through. And that once you have these drought situations and these high winds, no sort of fire break is going to stop that. These embers can go a quarter mile. So really we need to be hardening our homes and protecting our homes and just kind of letting the fires go through some of these older forests and realizing they're not, it seems at times like it's burning the whole forest, but it's not. It's patchy. A lot of the forests in a natural environment burn hot in spots and then skip over others entirely. So I think we have a lot to learn, and I think we need to change a lot of our behaviors around fire management.
And dealing with the smoke every year.
Yes. Oh my goodness. Yeah. Yeah.
So we have a couple of more philosophical questions or comments, and I'll do my best to phrase them, and then you can take them whatever direction you would like. And so this comment gets back to this idea of managing forests, and in some cases, maybe not managing the forest and letting the fire spread in the old growth forests. And this is really a comment about our relatively temporary time on Earth as a species versus the length of the Earth overall. And so it's really about, I'll read this exactly because I don't want to try to paraphrase it and then just let you riff off of it. And somebody that says that we could destroy the planet and the planet really won't care because it just moves on to the next phase, and that the ones that actually care are us. So could you comment on, as I said, riff on that idea?
Yeah, I agree. The planet is amazing. And as far as we know, it's the only place in the universe where there's life, this incredible thing, right? That grows and reproduces and changes over time. And all of these life forms have been created. And that's why this biodiversity crisis really gets to me. I mean, this is a miracle that this ball in this space has created all this stuff. So I agree with the questioner, if, you know, that the planet is going to keep living, because that's what it does. There's going to be life. There's going to be life forms. But as this particular life form, I have gotten a lot of joy from experiencing the beauty and the spiritual refreshment that I get from participating with the planet and seeing the other living things the way they're supposed to live. I call it the skin of the earth. I say sometimes the skin of the earth should just be the skin of the earth. And for us to be able to witness that in those places, whether it's an old growth forest or a coral reef or a prairie, is something very special. So yeah, you know, if we go, the earth is going to keep doing its thing. But while we're here, I think it's a moral obligation to protect that life that has evolved and to share that beauty with generations that come after us, instead of just gobbling it all up and destroying it.
The next question really builds on that idea of the shared beauty and how many people are not just recognizing that beauty, but really promoting it. So again, I'm going to read this one because I liked some of the phrasing and the nice pun. Trees seem pretty popular these days. See, that's why I had to read the initial piece. So thank you for that fun line. Talking about yourself and your work. So I'll paraphrase some from there. And Richard Powers' novel Overstory, NPR podcasts, Hidden Life of Trees, other podcasts, TED Talks, and so on. And so really the questioner is saying there's so much about trees these days. Are we jumping the shark? Are we getting too carried away with all of the focus on trees? And what are your thoughts?
Wow, interesting. Well, certainly I see, you know, every tree article that comes out, every tree book people are sending to me, and I feel like I have to read them all to keep up with them. And yes, there's a lot of them out there. And then the whole forest bathing movement too. And Richard Powers is a friend, and it was amazing to see his work and what it's done. Wow. And to put it in context, and now this might seem a little airy-fairy, but you know, when I started getting interested in trees, as I shared. I don't know why. I'd been working with smaller plants up to that time, and all of a sudden for me, it was trees. I don't know why. And then when I had the vision to create the Old Growth Forest Network, I don't know why that was. Same with, like Richard Powers. He had never really been a tree person at all. He took a hike in the hill and never planned to write about them. He took a hike in the hills and saw an old growth redwood tree, and all of a sudden changed his life. And now he's going to write about trees. So their time has come, maybe outside of us. And the other reason that the trees are in the news so much and we care about them so much is because climate change, of course. We talk about that a lot, and we know that the climate is changing and it is critical. And, that's related to the fires that we were talking about. And saving the trees is one of the prongs that we need if we're going to remove this excess carbon from the atmosphere. Yes, we have to stop burning fossil fuels the way we do, but that alone is not going to do it. We also have to stop cutting down the forests, because 85% of that carbon in the forest is immediately released when you cut it down. And we need to let some of the forests get older so it can hold more carbon. So we need to do both things at once. And I think people realize that. And so they're speaking for the trees to bring attention to that.
Thank you for the Dr. Seuss and Lorax reference. Very much appreciated. I know you said that you might mention the Lorax.
Yes.
Turning to a few more practical questions, but along those lines of letting the trees really grow. We had a question wondering how common it is for tree poaching, at least here in the US.
I haven't come up against it that much. Other people might have different stories, but yeah, no.
Okay. And then a second practical question, and is about Opal Creek as an old growth forest network forest, saying that it burned last year, and they're wondering how long it might take to come back, and when can we visit that forest?
Opal Creek was another forest in the Old Growth Forest Network that burned. I forgot to mention that. In fact, it was our 100th forest in the network. It was a big celebration there. And the man, George Atea, who actually helped to protect that forest to keep it from being cut down, because the Forest Service had plans to cut it down. And George said, no way. And he worked for a long time with other people to protect it. He actually died in that same fire that burned through Opal Creek. So the question, how long will it take to come back, is interesting, because it's like stepping in the same river twice. It will never come back to exactly what it was, but it will be a ecologically rich, complex forest. In fact, it already is today. I'm sure it won't look quite the same, and the organisms may have shifted a little bit, but you might not have the same birds, but you'll have different birds that like that scorched habitat. You'll have different insects that like that post-fire habitat, and the same with wildflowers. And so the old forests, when they burn, they retain this complexity of the big standing trees and the dad trees and the other things. So what will it look undamaged? Probably a few decades, but there'll always be fire scars on the trees. And but it'll be beautiful to the people, that don't know. You'll think, oh, this is this wonderful forest. As far as getting back in there again, I can't really say. That's really up to the individual management of each forest when they feel it's safe enough. And there's a fear these days, if the tree falls on somebody, that then they'll be sued. So that's a challenge. And there were a lot of structures got burned there too. So while we're talking about Opal Creek, there's a wonderful education center there. If anyone's ever been there, it was an old mining camp in the middle of this old growth forest. And then once the forest got saved, that mining area became an educational classroom where children would come. Well, those structures burned and they're not going to come back like the forest will. And so if you're interested in contributing to rebuilding those structures for the school children, I know they could use help.
In your last answer, you started to touch a little bit on the interplay between people visiting these old growth forests and some that are in the old growth forest network like Opal Creek and decisions by federal or state authorities. So we have a question asking about that relationship between the different government authorities and the old growth forest network.
It's interesting. We're all learning all the time. So many forest managers will approach them and say, we've identified your forest to be the old growth forest network. And some of them are so inviting and welcoming and excited about it. Some of them are not sure, and we need to either give up or educate them. And not all of our forests are governmentally owned forests. Some of them are land trust owned, some are organizations, some are camps, many different types of ownership. Some are owned by towns, some are owned by counties. And it's really interesting to see as the old growth forest network grows, and we may approach let's say, someone in a national forest, and they're not quite sure, but then we show them the list of the other forests in national forests that are in the old growth forest network. And so then they say, oh, okay. And for them, then it's actually becomes a point of pride and something that they can put on their performance review for the year. And we have this dedication celebration where they get to talk and maybe there's press. So I think it's a way to bring together the people that love old forests with some of these government agencies.
Thinking about the old phrase, it's not what you know, it's who you know. And I felt like you just worked that in a bit about we know these forests, and so you should know these other forests, or you want your forest to be known as well. Get your forest on the list.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And then, so now we have a situation where Pennsylvania and Ohio are competing for who can have the most forests in the old growth forest network. And right now they're tied. And both of those states, the state conservation, they have different names in every state, but the state Department of Conservation and Recreation, whatever, now they've loved these dedications and this attention so much and going on these hikes through their old forests that they're looking for other areas that can be in the old growth forest network. So that's a way that we can also help to protect forests. So it might be an area in a forest that doesn't have protection from commercial logging, but they'll say, let's make it a natural area. So then it can be in the old growth forest network and it's protected.
So really what I'm hearing here is if we have anybody tuned in from Pennsylvania or from Ohio, first of all, we recognize it's really late there, just like it's very late for you, Joan. Second, go find a forest and nominate it and let your state lead in that old growth forest network competition.
That's right. Become a county coordinator.
All right. Again, while we were just talking about Ohio and Pennsylvania, many of the people tuned in are here in the Pacific Northwest. So we have a question closer to home here, which is what can we learn from the regrowth after the Mount St. Helens eruption?
Well, that gets back to this fabulous ball we call the Earth in space that just wants to live. So you leave a place alone on this Earth and it is going to be covered with life. And I think Mount St. Helens is a place to celebrate. It's proof of that.
question now, getting back to East Coast. So we're alternating East Coast, West Coast forest competition, not just between states. And this was a mention to something you said earlier in your talk about the Eastern chestnut. And this is a question about some of your take on some of the projects to recreate those Eastern chestnut forests. And specifically, this person says that they heard that one of the plans is to have 15/16 Eastern chestnut and 1/16 Asian chestnut, if I'm getting that correct. And so they asked, should we be planting those in the forest now, or should we leave forest chestnut less?
Well, that is an excellent question. And I would say that I really don't have a good answer to that myself. That's another area that I've still kind of left open. I know I'll disappoint a lot of people who really have been working hard for the chestnut recovery, and they want to plant these chestnuts back in the forest. And they were a very important component of our eastern forest, one of our larger trees, a very important food source for a lot of animals. But I tend to be more of a, I don't know whether you call it a purist, but just to trust in nature more. I really am uncomfortable with the idea of, especially the genetically engineered trees that they're creating and putting them back in the forest. Yeah, so I'm not really quite for or quite against that. I'll wait and see.
We have a question more about you and your past, which you talked a little bit about earlier on. The question is really about your background and skill set that gave you the skills, the tools to create the Old Growth Forest Network.
Yeah, I don't know how I've been so successful about that, but maybe a combination of vision and manifestation, that I've been able to have the vision. And a lot of people have a lot of wonderful ideas, but then there comes the work, the sitting in the chair, the making yourself do it, the eating the right food, the getting enough sleep, all the things that it takes to manifest it, to design, to have limits on your life so that you can have the energy to do it and the freedom to do it. So I think of those things really as gifts, but that ability to manifest is also what gave me the ability to complete my education and get my PhD. That idea, the vision, oh, I can do this, but then sitting in the chair and actually doing it and completing the work. And one thing that I've learned, not so much with creating the Old Growth Forest Network, but with writing my books, is how important that PhD education was in training me to read scientific literature, to not be afraid of it, to say, oh, why do salamanders have external gills, some of them an internal gills, or whatever question you can think of. And to be able to dive into the scientific literature, to read all those papers, to come to conclusions about things. And so I love that research piece. And so Treepedia allowed me to do a little bit more of that, and Nature's Temples too. But I think that's a skill from our education we don't always think about. We think, oh, you get the PhD, you get a job, you write a paper in this. No, it's those research, reading and writing skills that are very important from learning that science.
So wish more of my students were tuned in right now. I don't know how many of them are. I'm also a professor. And yes, I absolutely agree. And also just thinking about what you said about vision and manifestation. I mean, what we're doing right now with Science on Tap was really the vision and manifestation of Amanda and all of the minions and everybody that's making this possible. And like you said, just sometimes getting the butt in the chair and doing the work.
Yeah.
2 more questions. So one big question. So take it maybe in chunks, or maybe just give us a vignette, because I suspect this question could be an entire talk.
Mm-hmm.
And we have somebody asking, have you seen climate change affecting what can grow in a particular forest?
I have not really personally, but the forests move so slowly compared to us. So maybe if I were to live 500 years, I would see that, but I haven't seen it yet personally in my own life. But I do feel for the sequoia trees, right? There's these sequoia trees that have been around for so many millions of years, and we are literally seeing them disappear before our eyes for many reasons. Some we've just cut down and destroyed. Some have burned. Some looks like they're dying from drought or whatever the reasons are. And to just sit by, they're not going to disappear in the next 500 years either, but they're going that way. And to be here and watch that happen is difficult.
All right, one last question, but first I did see a comment in the chat that I do want to reiterate for those that aren't on Zoom but are on YouTube or on Facebook. Right, when I mentioned the minions, that's the team's preferred name. I'm actually staring at a screen right now that says Q&A minion, recording minion. So I'm not saying anything derogatory with that term. That predates the yellow things, as Scott was saying. Our final question for the evening, this is one that Amanda always likes to end on, particularly in these challenging times, is, Joan, why do you think it's important for people to learn about science?
I think it's because anybody can have an opinion about anything, right? And you can, this is right, that's right. You can have an opinion, but what science does is it tries to get beyond opinion to the facts. And when science is done right, it doesn't really have an agenda. It's just trying to get at the truth. And when science is done right, it is not a servant to financial gain, which so much else that happens in our society is. And the other thing I love about science personally is that so many people are working to answer these questions, and then they publish this so we all get to find out the answers, not only the answers, but sometimes we find out that nobody's even has the answer. Sometimes people assume science knows everything. They've done all these studies, but then you get in there and you realize, oh, nobody knows what snails live in Maryland or whatever. There's a lot that we do not know. And I love science for that too.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joan. I so agree with you there. That's one of my favorite things about both the research and the teaching that I do as well, is having students ask me a question in class where not only do I not know the answer, but nobody does.
Right.
So we might have an opportunity to go to the lab or go to the field and find out.
Mm-hmm. That might be their piece to answer.
Exactly. Yes. All right. Thank you very much again, Joan. Everybody, please stick around for a final few announcements, including a preview of the next Science on Tap coming up the end of the month. As I said, the team took a bit of a summer vacation, but is returning again. This was the first return after summer. There'll be another talk coming up virtually on September 30th. The title, Hands Up, Don't Shoot, Policing as a Public Health Crisis. And this is a team of epidemiologists and sociologists and experts on race and diversity and equity coming to you from around the country. So please tune in again on September 30th for that talk. Also, we'd like to thank all of our sponsors. Science on Tap is occurring because of all of your support. So thank you very much to everybody who donates on Patreon. These are the names of all the sponsors that give $10 a month or more on Patreon. And if you like what you've seen tonight, please go out to Patreon and become a sponsor of Science on Tap as well. And in particular, I want to call out that as we move forward into the continuing life that we all have now, and hopefully a move towards more face-to-face endeavors, that the Science on Tap team is really committed to a hybrid approach moving forward, and that takes money because it takes additional equipment. So please go out and not just donate to support the efforts that you see right now virtually, but donate to get the additional equipment so that people then in the future will have the choice. Do I want to tune in virtually from around the world, or do I want to sit in a seat with other vaccinated people in the future and raise that glass in person? So please go out and become one of the Science on Tap sponsors. If you're interested in doing that, just go here. You can either make that one-time donation. So again, for that critically needed equipment at www.makeyoutthink.org, or become a monthly sponsor with your ongoing donation at patreon.com/makeyoutthink. So thank you everybody for tuning in, especially those on the East Coast and in other very late time zones. Enjoy the rest of your evening and keep enjoying and thinking about science. Have a good night.